actually.
That's again.
Is Tom headed out here anytime, or is he?
Okay. Good morning. I'm Howard Walpe, Director of the Africa Program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I'm delighted to welcome all of you on behalf of the Wilson Center's Africa Program and on behalf of the Enough Project, the Project to End Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity. This is a co-sponsored event, and I won't say much about the Wilson Center, assuming that most of you are familiar with it, but just very briefly, the center was established in 1968 by an act of Congress to serve as the living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. It aims to bridge the gap between the world of ideas and the world of public policy, and is a nonpartisan institute for advanced study and serves as a neutral forum for open, serious, and informed dialogue on national and global issues. I'm very pleased to welcome to the center this morning four very distinguished panelists to discuss one of the most urgent of all crises on the African continent at the moment, the Zimbabwean transition. We're going to have here in the following sequence, and I'll give the introductions now. First, from Jamal Jaffrey. He is a senior peace fellow with the Public International Law and Policy Group and a consultant with the Enough Project. He's worked in Zimbabwe as an information and documentation officer for the Amani Trust, a human rights monitoring group, and later as a consultant for the International Crisis Group, conducting research and advocacy focused on the current political crisis. He currently works with governments and sub-state entities in the developing world to help draft plans for demobilization programs and transitional justice initiatives. He'll begin with a kind of a macro overview of the Zimbabwean crisis. He'll be followed by Dilpan Silva, a senior program officer at the National, I think I probably followed that up badly. Senior program officer at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. For the past several years, he has been working with democratic political and civic groups in Zimbabwe in the run-up to the national elections in March 2008. Previously, he managed an assessment to determine the role of legislatures in sub-Saharan Africa to promote transparency in the extractive industries. He is also, among our panelists, the most recently in Zimbabwe, there during some of the most recent violence and chaos that we have all heard about and read about. Following Dilpan, who will be discussing sort of the kind of the situation on the ground, and both in terms of the violence and the evolving political situation, will be Ray Choto. He is the senior editor with the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Project at the Voice of America. A Zimbabwean himself, he has worked as the chief investigative reporter for the Weekly Standard newspaper in Zimbabwe. He's won several journalism awards, including the James Cameron Award for Excellence in Journalism, administered by the City University in London, and the International Press Freedom Award, administered by the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression. And then finally, as our cleanup hitter, handling the discussion of the policy and regional implications of the evolving developments in Zimbabwe, is Gail Smith, an old colleague of mine from my days in the State Department. Gail is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and co-chair of the Enough Project. She served as a special assistant to the president and a senior director for African Affairs at the National Security Council from 1998 to 2001. She was also senior advisor to the chief of staff of USAID from 1994 to 1998. She was based in Africa for over 20 years as a journalist covering military, economic, and political affairs. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the center. And we will now we're going to ask each of the panelists to speak about 10 minutes. So we will have maximum time for some questions and answers involving our audience. I should say that today's program is being webcast live. Let us begin then with Jamal Jaffrey.
Thanks, Howard. Well, here we are again. Another Zimbabwe election, another great Wilson Center event, another possibility for hope. But we've all been down this road before. I think one of the important questions that we hope to illuminate a bit today is, why is this election cycle different? Why is there so much international attention? What's differentiated the events of the last few months with what's been going on for the past 8 years of the crisis? And I think being an optimist in Zimbabwe can be a very dangerous thing, but I think that there is hope for some optimism that this entire process, through one way or another, could result in some type of meaningful change in Zimbabwe. The methods for that might be extremely severe, but the end result might be something that would surprise many, at least many pessimists. So where are we now? With I'm sure you're all aware of the events of the past few months. The opposition having an announced lead in the presidential election, the opposition taking control of parliament. These are absolutely unprecedented events in the history of Zimbabwe. I think when the MDC came on the scene in 99, 2000, that was the first time it was a bit of a shock to the system, to ZANU-PF and the government, when they won nearly 50% of the vote, but they were still very much the minority party. As they stand right now, pending the outcome of election challenges, they are the majority party in parliament. They can control an election for a new president should the president die or become incapacitated. There is a real possibility, there's I would say a likelihood that they will garner more votes in the runoff election. Whether those votes will be counted and whether the vote will be recognized is another issue altogether. But this is absolutely uncharted territory. But in order to get to the end game, I think we need to look very carefully at what could happen, what is happening up until the runoff on June 27th. ZANU-PF has a very, very old playbook in terms of dealing with elections, and it's on one hand controlled by violence and intimidation, and on another it craves legitimacy. It craves the need for an actual vote to be counted and recognized by international observers, and those two play together. My first extended experience in Zimbabwe was in 2001, talking with victims of the 2000 parliamentary elections, and I remember very specifically the playbook that was used against them then is the same now. Massive violence and intimidation up until the point of the election. Once the election days come, the violence and intimidation is scaled back. Election observers are let in. The vote is considered to be relatively free and fair because on the days of the election, it looks relatively free and fair. And then afterwards, it's an announced ZANU-PF victory. But the ZANU's playbook over the past few years has tried to evolve and get a bit more legitimate to alleviate international pressure. Whereas initially it relied mainly on violence. Several laws were passed over the past few years to kind of consolidate ZANU-PF's grip on total power within Zimbabwe. The Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act and the Public Order and Security Act greatly restricted any opposition group's ability to hold meetings, conduct rallies, campaign in rural areas, greatly restricted the media. Foreign members of the press have to apply for registration. Local members of the press have to apply for registration. There is no independent electronic media inside of Zimbabwe. There is very limited or arguably no independent print media inside Zimbabwe. ZANU-PF is the only game in town. Now, that scenario has worked very well for ZANU-PF up until this past election. You would have international observers come in and recognize a vote that was, let's say, in the neighborhood of 55-45 for the ruling party. That would be enough that it gave it a sense of legitimacy. Now, the election was never free and fair, any of the past elections, because of the laws that put the opposition at a disadvantage and because of the pre-election violence. But it gave it enough legitimacy that some SADC states would come by, rubber stamp the results, and then the regime would continue on. Now, one thing that the regime didn't count on was violence and intimidation in concert with the just absolutely dismal economic situation. The latest numbers that I've seen is that inflation is running at about 1,000,000% right now. The estimates are that inflation could hit 5,000,000% by the end of the year. In the run-up to the runoff, one of the internal calculations that the regime came up with as to whether it wanted to contest the runoff was wondering whether it could afford it. And the last number that I saw was that the regime, in order to print ballots, deploy people around the country, in order to contest the runoff election, they would need to come up with 4 quadrillion Zimbabwean dollars. Now, I had to look that number up myself just to make sure I got the right definition. But the economy is not getting any better with the regime as it is. And this is not only just a matter of of President Mugabe and the political instability. It's also the policies that have been put in place, the declining agricultural production. There is no good scenario by which ZANU-PF can hold power and the economy can rebound. So when the March elections came around, you had the same old violence and intimidation at about the same levels of the past. That coupled with what the government underestimated was extreme dissatisfaction on the part of the populace. That they didn't think with the populace, especially in the rural areas, would turn out and vote against the government. But people are literally starving. The refugees flowing into South Africa and other SADC states are increasing exponentially day to day. The situation is quite desperate. When you've got white-collar office workers in the capital surviving on one meal a day and walking to work because they can't afford transport, that situation is untenable. So they were caught by surprise. And they also put in place, because of a deal mediated by South Africa with the opposition, certain minor, what at the time would appear to be minor electoral protections, which called for releasing votes at the voting place and a bit more transparency in the process of voting, which eventually led to an opposition victory. Now, the question is, where does this lead us from here, and aren't they just going to go back to the same old tactics? ZANU-PF, as I said before, they have one playbook. It's violence and controlling public life. They're going back to that playbook, and they're going back to the violence at a level that's absolutely unprecedented in the last 8 years. The last numbers that I saw were 50 deaths of the opposition, which is probably on the low end, 11 people beaten to death in one particularly gruesome incident, thousands arrested, thousands displaced, tens of thousands, I should say. But the strategy appears to be to go into areas that were formerly ZANU-PF strongholds that switched to the MDC, create such incredible violence and intimidation that people that live in those areas are displaced to other parts of the country and then can't go then and vote in their local constituencies. It's the hope that that will produce enough votes for a presidential victory. But this isn't guaranteed. ZANU-PF doesn't necessarily have the power to completely stuff ballot boxes. It has the power to do that, and it has the power to create questions about the results of elections. But there is a real possibility that, despite the violence, despite the intimidation, despite manipulating postal votes, and some of the other tactics that they've used in the past, once all that is said and done, the unease of the people, the anger and distrust of the government may be so great that an opposition victory could occur over and above the government's ability to rig the results of that election. Now, I think given a free and fair vote, which we can already say the vote will not be free and fair because of the violence, but given a free and fair vote, based on the exit polls and the numbers, I think there's no question that the opposition would win such a vote. But even if they are announced as the winner of the runoff election, then that brings into play what happens then. The chances that the government will step back and recognize the opposition and let Morgan Tsvangirai form a government that's led by the MDC is very slim. There are probably 30 or 40 people in this room. There's probably 30 or 40 different scenarios as to how this could all turn out. It's very difficult to predict. But I think that what we need to focus on especially is the internal dynamics of ZANU-PF. ZANU-PF is terribly divided. I think for the first time, and this is one thing that's changed quite severely from past elections, for the first time there's a widespread recognition within ZANU-PF that Mugabe must leave. They don't necessarily want a complete changeover. They want ZANU-PF continuation. There's not a complete agreement on who his successor could be. But I think they all recognize that the economic situation, the political situation is absolutely untenable. If Mugabe were to take power, he's eligible to rule for another 6 years. If that happens, it's just unfathomable what the economic situation could be like. You would have massive refugee exodus around to southern African nations, some of which is already occurring. So there's a strong element within the party to transition to either a government of national unity or a ZANU-PF-dominated government that still maintains its grip on power. The prospects for that are they're literally countless, but I think a lot does depend on the military. There's been a lot made in the press about the possibility of a military coup and what the preceding results from that would be. It's difficult to say that the military themselves are of one mind. You've got the rank-and-file soldiers who long ago have given up their strong allegiance to Mugabe. That doesn't mean that they will turn against him or that there will be a coup against Mugabe. I think that they are one of the few organizations in the country that are still paid. There's massive violence and intimidation against members of the military and the security services to stay in line and carry out the will. But the chances that they could rise up and overthrow an elected regime, it's questionable. Among the top echelon of military leaders, you also have splits. There's at a very minimum 2 to 3 major factions within ZANU-PF that are vying for power and are either trying to ride Mugabe's coattails to be anointed the successor or emerge as a successor if he does actually step down. Everyone's jockeying for position right now. There's no stable position. And at the end of the day, I think what the international community has to focus on is where regional SADC governments may fall and what kind of pressure can come from the outside. Within SADC, SADC is feeling this crisis like it's never felt it before. The recent anti-immigrant violence in South Africa is a direct result of the Zimbabwe crisis. There's a possibility that could replicate in other Southern African countries. You've got 25,000 Zimbabwean refugees from South Africa going to Zambia and dispersing out to other countries. Zambia, Botswana, Tanzania, Namibia, all the SADC countries have been feeling the economic pinch of the Zimbabwean crisis for quite a while. They've also been feeling heavy pressure from the rest of Africa and from outside to step in and manage some kind of transition. But this is absolutely unprecedented levels of pressure on them. There's a possibility that they could step in and try to come up with some kind of managed transition. But at the end of the day, we're dealing with a government. In essence, there really is no government in Zimbabwe right now. This runoff election should have been held months ago. There is an elected parliament that hasn't been able to sit. The political instability is quite severe. What needs to happen is for a democratically elected government to be seated in Zimbabwe. That may mean simply not necessarily a government that comes about from the election, even though according to the law that's what should happen, but a government that is accepted by the people. The NBC has been showing signs that it may reach out to the military. It may reach out to some moderate members of ZANU-PF. There could be discussions around a national unity government. There could be discussions around some type of coalition among some of the top moderate leaders. But that's a question for after the election. But until now, unfortunately, I think the situation will only get worse up until June. But the results really could be very surprising. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Turn now to Dilapan.
Thanks, Howard. So I was most recently there in Zimbabwe in mid-April. I got there, been going to Zimbabwe for the last 2 years or so, and working with NDI, the National Democratic Institute, for the past 4 years, working on Zimbabwe for the past 2 or 3 years, and was most recently in the country for about a month before the elections through till about mid-April. So I saw some of what played out post-election, sort of the ramp-up in violence and the crackdown against the opposition and civic supporters on the ground in Harare and outside as well. I know there's a few of you in the audience here who have had the unfortunate pleasure of being detained or interrogated by intelligence and security officers. I had the same experience in Zimbabwe following the election, due in part to some of our work with local partners on the ground, civic and political, looking to monitor the elections. Jamal touched on a couple of points that I think are very important. I think the key piece here, of course, is the fissures that are there in ZANU-PF at the moment in the regime. I think that previous sort of elections and in Zimbabwe's political history, there have always been talk or suspicions that there are different camps and factions within ZANU-PF that have been vying for power, whether to ride on the coattails of Mugabe or to take power sort of by a coup or by coercive methods. What I think is different about this election and this cycle is that, one, those fissures are public and are more apparent in the media and outside. And then secondarily, I think the point that should be stressed about this election that makes it categorically different than previous elections in Zimbabwe is the fact of the openness of sort of political dialogue and data that surrounded this election and the projections that were released by civic and the opposition groups following the election, sort of in the interim period when it took almost 3 to 4 weeks for the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission to announce the results. Those exercises, that data provided, I believe, Zimbabwean citizens with some semblance of information. And I think along with the fissures within the party and how that has been made public in the media, the data that has been provided to folks on the ground and internationally and regionally in Southern Africa, I think made a difference in pushing the regime towards accepting or at least trying to maneuver their way around accepting the results of the election. And that makes it categorically different from previous elections and previous history in Zimbabwe. The hope, I think, is that in this coming second round, that there is some semblance of continued political, open political space and dialogue as well, and that one of the key things, the key regulations and practices that took place in the last election, which would be the posting of the results outside each polling station at the close of polls after counting had taken place, is continued. Now, there's no guarantee that that will happen in this second round, but I think that piece in particular, along with regional and local monitoring, are probably 2 or 3 of the key pieces that need to take place in the run-up to these elections, in the runoff elections coming up next month on June 27th. There's been a lot of talk about how there's some change in the political landscape in Zimbabwe, and some of the terms that have been thrown around include electoral cleansing, which you're seeing right now in Zimbabwe, and what we began to see just after the election was a distinct targeting to opposition groups, not only in urban areas, where in the past, what you would hear about, at least in the media, was a targeting of opposition supporters and civic groups in Harare and the other central cities. What you're seeing now is a more public and repressive, systematic violence being perpetrated against folks in the rural areas as well. That has always been, I think, ongoing for folks that study Zimbabwe and who are working in Zimbabwe and in the region. What I think is apparent now is that the level of violence and the crackdown is much, much more systematic. Where we are hearing reports from our folks on the ground and civic partners that there are lists of people and folks that are being targeted, that will be targeted, and this is moving it's moving from not just the political parties but to civic groups as well. I'm sure some of you know that one of our close partners, the Zimbabwe Electoral Support Network, ZESN, who released the projections 2 days after the close of polls in the first round, have had their offices raided, their officers detained and interrogated as well. These sort of acts, I think, are different and signify, I think, a step up in terms of what the Lenser regime will go to in terms of making sure that its interests are taken care of. According to some groups on the ground, there are more than 1,000 Zimbabwean families that have been displaced by this ongoing wave of political violence, again, perpetrated primarily in the rural areas. And what's important to note about this is that it's on the scale approaching what the government's 2005 election campaign with Operation Ramachina. So what we're seeing is that the folks that were being displaced in the urban areas through that operation that then moved to rural areas, those same folks who, for the most part, are opposition supporters, are now being displaced from those rural areas. And the question right now is, where are they going? Jamal mentioned that they're going primarily abroad, whether it's between South Africa and Zambia, but then, of course, there's the consequences of sort of the anti-foreigner violence happening in the region as well. So there's, a strong sense of desperation and fear on the part of Zimbabwean people on the ground in terms of where can one go now when you're moved from both urban areas to then rural areas, and then in rural areas now being targeted as well. And there have also been threats, in talking to some of our local partners on the ground, when folks are being harassed and intimidated. The threats have included statements that if Mugabe lost in the runoff, there would be war. akin to what happened during the War of Liberation. And that should not happen again, so please toe the line. But what's interesting to note about the threats that are mentioned to folks that are being intimidated is that there is a mix of sort of the fear on the part of the officers themselves, in the sense that please don't make us do what we're being asked to do. And I think that is something that is also different. You know, in our work on the ground there and in talking to local partners, there's a sense not just in the police, but also in the Army and other parts of the security apparatus, where the lower rank and file and some of their mid-ranking security intelligence officers and police do see the winds of change. The question is, will they, at what threshold will they seek to not perpetrate violence and not intimidate or harass individuals in the rural areas and families, including women and children? I don't think there is a point at which that is happening as yet, but at least that question is now being raised. At least there is some sense of dialogue taking place where security and police officers are questioning the motives and their own actions on the ground in Zimbabwe. As Jamal also mentioned, access to state media is still very closed, and independent media are being targeted as well by the violence. This past weekend, a truck carrying copies of the Zimbabwean newspaper, which was produced by expatriates and distributed in Zimbabwe, was hijacked and burned. The holding of rallies still remains almost impossible. The MDC had to appeal to the High Court to get an order to hold their last two rallies due to police bans that are closing much-needed political space. And the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission has announced that while domestic observers and foreign and local journalists can apply for accreditation this week or the coming next week, it's unlikely that foreign journalists and or international observers will receive accreditation in Zimbabwe. The hope is that SADC, the Southern African Development Community, with their larger observer team, will be able to observe the elections. They're planning to field, I believe, around 200 observers. Whether or not that'll be enough to man all of the different areas within the country effectively, I doubt it. But the hope is that SADC, with regional pressure and international pressure, will be able to field a very impartial observer mission. The Pan-African Parliament is also planning to field a mission with 30 observers. There's a hope that the Pan-African Parliament, because they're a bit more impartial, will be able to provide some level of impartiality to their assessment. But I think it's important with any regional monitoring effort that there is international and regional, both political as well as civic pressure to make sure that these missions are objective. Past experience with elections in Zimbabwe shows that during the period immediately prior to the election, the regime usually softens up its stance in terms of intimidation, violence. The space for media usually opens. The MDC and other opposition civic and political groups are able to hold rallies. But it should be remembered that being able to hold a rally or print independent media or broadcast independent media a week before an election is not sufficient time to provide a level electoral playing field for the opposition or other groups in the country, which is why it's important that in the next month or so prior to this election on June 27th, at least by the beginning of next week, that there are steps put in place to ensure a level playing field for the opposition in the country. And I know that the MDC is calling for this, but it's also something that the civic groups on the ground are calling for as well, including the Zimbabwe Electoral Support Network. What will also be intriguing to see, I think, in the coming runoff will be the levels of voter turnout. In the first round, the levels of voter turnout were slightly lower than they were in previous elections, and again, I think folks pointed to the fact of the voter registration exercise not being effective in disenfranchising primarily voters in the younger age group. But also not being able to register in there, that not being enough centers around to go and register and apply to vote. I I think the crackdown throughout the country, the increased levels of violence and intimidation will definitely have an impact on voter turnout. The hope is that even though that happened in the first round and in preceding the first round elections at the end of March, that there will still be some semblance of support for the opposition, and that the fear and desperation will not kick in enough that it'll deter voters from voting. The sense from some of the opinion and polling research from local groups in Zimbabwe is that while there is a strong level of desperation and fear on the part of citizens in Zimbabwe, even the ones that remain and have not fled the country or into different parts of the in different parts of the region, there is still a sense of slim, but still a sense of optimism and hope that there is a need, there has been an opening, that this past election, the first round, was different for a number of the issues that I spoke to earlier, and that this could be the turning point in Zimbabwe. The hope is that the ballot box can do that, but in order for that to happen, regional and local monitoring of elections needs to take place, and there needs to be strong international and regional pressure in order to make that objective and effective. And the point about the polling, posting the results of the polling station results outside the booth is also very important as well. Then there are three other issues I think that are important in terms of next steps that need to take place before this election, runoff election takes place. There are a number of changes to legislation and laws that came about as a part of the SADC-mediated negotiation late last year that has still not been put into place. They were supposed to be put into place at the early part of this year and still have not been done so at this part. Some of these things are important, including access to media, being able to hold political rallies, as well as the smaller things that focus on the influence and sort of objectivity on the part of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission officials. Right now, what you're seeing is a lot of the ZEC officials themselves being targeted and harassed. There's been reports of teachers, the ones who man polling stations in areas that voted with the opposition, being harassed and intimidated. So there's also an issue in terms of the ZEC and its independence that I think will need to be dealt with effectively. And again, I think this is something that is going to be hard to do, is important to do for civic groups internally within the country, but I think is an important thing that regional and international pressure should focus on. One is, again, regional and national monitoring and local monitoring of the elections. And then secondarily, the independence of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission needs to be put into place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And for our, third speaker, we'll turn to Ray Choto.
Thank you very much. I will try to look at some of the challenges that this runoff is facing from a media perspective. The first two gentlemen have covered quite a lot of space, but I'll try to highlight some of the issues which I think are not known by so many people outside Zimbabwe. The Zimbabwe government have actually embarked on a kind of a militarization process where they've been deploying military and senior military officers into provinces to ensure that they do influence the result of the poll when the runoff is done on June 27. I'll explain why. We have received reports that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, which my dear colleague had just mentioned, it doesn't have the capacity to run this election. And they've extended an invitation to the military and the police to become election agents or election officers. The teachers who did quite a very good job during the March 29 election, most of them are scared. They cannot go back and be election officers because they've been targeted, they've been beaten up. Some of them are still facing charges. They are scared of going back. The government has unleashed the militia into these rural areas where people have been beaten up and have been displaced to an extent that if the runoff is to take place, I mean, the voting is ward-based. You have to go back and vote in a constituent that you are registered. And we are having this situation where you have people from the rural areas have already left their homes because they have been beaten up, families have been killed. As I speak today, the Movement for Democratic Changes in Mrewa burying an activist who was abducted last week and murdered, Shadrach Jani. There was also another activist, again well-known, Ndira, who was also abducted, and the next thing they saw, he was already dead. So there has been a systematic, threat and intimidation, abduction, and killing of members of the opposition. So when we get these reports, we look at why is this being done? Is the government really in a position to create a level playing political field? But what we are getting is not what people would want. The Movement for Democratic Change, as it is getting into this election, I'm sure they are doing it under protest. The environment is not conducive for them. People have been murdered, people have been beaten up, and I don't think that even their own election agents are going to be in a position to be deployed into these rural areas. We are talking about almost close to 4,000 polling stations that need to be monitored. And even if we are talking about the SADC, how many people are coming? About 200 people coming to observe the elections. And the government has extended its invitation to SADC, election observers. But for the local observers, they've been told to reapply. What does that mean? And we are only a few days away from the runoff. So the situation which is being created on the ground seem to indicate that, this election is not going to be free and fair. There may be no violence on election day, but it's the process that we have to look at. How are things being done on the ground? If ZESNI and other organizations are not being given the opportunity to register their monitors right now, why would they be asked to resubmit when, in fact, this is a runoff, it's a continuation from the election of 29 March, and therefore rules and regulations should not be changed. But they are being changed for local observers. But SADC, they're being given a free ride. They're allowed to come, and they're just going to be in Zimbabwe just 2 weeks before elections. So if you are talking about international observers monitoring, what space are they going to cover? If you are talking about 4,000 polling stations or the whole country, they would go to some of these areas, but the guys have introduced new strategies of dealing with members of the opposition. People are being abducted at night. You go there during the day, people tell you that, it was quiet. But in other areas, it's quite volatile, where there have been some curfews that have been imposed by the military. You cannot go into certain areas after 6 p.m. In Zimbabwe. But this is not an official curfew, but the military has just imposed because, they're in charge. We have received reports of the names of the people who are running these operations. From a media perspective, we have tried to get in touch with them, but they are not. Even the people from ZANU-PF, when we try to engage them to ask them why they are doing this, it's not easy to get them. You get once in a while people like Bright Matonga, who is so overzealous, would want to talk. And surprisingly, we got a phone call from the Minister of Health, Dr. David Parenyatwa, yesterday, when we published the story of the violence that is taking place in his area. And he even said that there was nothing like that happened. We asked him about Shepherd Jani. That's the area that the minister comes from, and he said he was outside the country in Geneva, so he's going to investigate. So the situation is so bad for the opposition, but they have to. They, part and parcel of the whole process. They have to make sure that they participate in this political process. But the challenges that are there is that, I'm not an election observer. I'm not a lawyer. But the general feeling on the ground is that the opposition won that election. There was no need for this runoff. Something was done. If that is true, again, what guarantee is in place that, this thing is going to happen again? The law provides it quite clear that, in this runoff, there are only 2 candidates, Tsvangirai and Mugabe. And one of them can pull out 21 days before the election. But let's say in the event that they have the same votes, all of them, there's going to be another crisis again, because the law in Zimbabwe is that, as you were talking, that parliament has not been sworn in because there is no president. What about if they have this rerun again and they tie, they've got the same votes. It's very possible because people still think that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission manufactures some of those figures. But these guys are getting into this election under protest, knowing very well that they have no control of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. It's not independent. If it's inviting members from the police force, from the army, and civil servants to participate in this process, what does that mean? When in fact, when you're talking about the laws that were put in place as a result of the negotiations between the MDC and ZANU-PF, as my friend has earlier on elaborated, they have not been implemented. ZEC, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, was supposed to have been reconstituted, but that was not done. The Electoral Act itself, it provides an explanation for how a president is chosen. There is a section which says that the president has to have a 50% plus one vote. The same act has provision for somebody to be elected a simple majority one is declared. So had this happened, had Mugabe actually won that election, I don't think we're going to have this rerun that we are having, the runoff, because they were going to use the other part of the Electoral Act, which says a simple majority, you are declared president. But we are dealing here with the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. It claims to be very independent, but I doubt it. And the people we talk to, they confirm that, it is not independent because of the way it has been doing its work. It had made an argument that the runoff has to be done within 21 days. But it's saying it is within 21 days of the election. But the argument is that after the announcement of the election, but I know an election is when you actually go and cast your vote. So, again, this runoff is outside the provision of the Constitution. That's what other people are talking about, that there is a deliberate attempt on the part of the government to use the law to its advantage and keep on breaking its own laws. And nobody seems to be criticizing the Zimbabwe government. I don't know much about the quiet diplomacy headed by President Thabo Mbeki, but the opposition have made it quite clear that they have no confidence in Mbeki as a mediator. So you can see that the opposition is getting into this election, not that really they are quite confident that, everything is okay, but there has been so much pressure within the region that they have to respect the laws of the country. Yes, they have to respect the laws of the country. Because I also blame the opposition too, because they're also part of this whole process. The Electoral Act, there were members who were involved in coming up with this Electoral Act, which had two meaning or two explanation on how a president has to be declared. If there were some of these problems, I'm sure those guys who were at the forefront, they should have highlighted this. But they are getting into this. Their argument is that they were, in negotiations. Sometimes you have to consider certain things, and sometimes you need to come to a kind of a compromise. That was their argument, and that's why Zimbabwe right now is facing this situation. The economy, as my colleagues have stated, is in tatters. You're talking about a country that is full of poor billionaires. The exchange right now, $1 to Zimbabwean dollars, talking about 700 million. What can you buy with that? Nothing. We were talking about the violence in South Africa. If you look at it, what does this really mean? Again, you hear people and voices crying to go back to Zimbabwe. But they are saying, again, even if they go back to Zimbabwe, there are people who left Zimbabwe for economic reasons. There are people who actually had to leave Zimbabwe because their lives were in danger. And where do these people go to? They've got nowhere to go. So when we look at these stories, we look at, okay, here's a runoff. We are here to report. We don't take sides. We cover as much as what the ZANU-PF does. We also cover the members of the opposition. But of late, I think there were some kind of instructions from the ZANU-PF that they should not talk to the Western media or the media which is not friendly to the Zimbabwe government. We understand, and there has been a committee that has been set up to deal with the media, headed by Mnangagwa, although Bright Matonga is being the spokesperson, and Patrick Chinamasa, the justice minister. But If you look at the way that they are doing is that, I mean, they sat down and made a recommendation that the chief executive of the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation must be removed because he gave airtime to the opposition, which is required by the electoral laws. That, I mean, there must be some level playing field as far as media coverage is concerned. They did try in the run-up to the last election that they were given the opposition figures some time in the media, but what happened after that? People have been fired. What does that mean to the next person who has been appointed when he's going to cover this election? Is the opposition going to be given enough time to campaign? They may have some kind of, I mean, support from other media organizations, but we're talking about direct impact. They may come out on CNN, they may come out on all these networks, but the ordinary person in the rural areas does not have access to information. They do not know what is happening. And people are afraid to go into these rural areas. So these are some of the challenges that we face. Lucky enough, we're a radio program. I mean, people can access our programs in 3 languages, Shona, Ndebele, and English. They can hear what is going. But, you know, they will also have problems with transmission. That, I mean, Studio 7 is being jammed in certain areas. So people do not have access to information or what is going or what is happening in their own area. And people will accept things by word of mouth. If you tell them, then they respect you. You tell them that is coming from the Herald or other papers, they may start to say, okay, fine, this is what is being said, but we are not hearing the other side. So if you look at the rural population, I think this is where the job that has to be done. The urban area, that's not a problem. I think people know their rights. They can intimidate them, but people in rural areas are isolated. That's why you find out all these abductions, the intimidation, the beating, the deployment of military personnel. It's being targeted into these rural areas, and people are running away. And there is an election on 27 June. So how are they going to vote? Who is going to protect their lives if at that time they were beaten up and nobody was there to protect them? So these are some of the fears that are being raised that, yes, this is a rerun or a runoff, but are we going to have as many people as those who voted on March 29? The information that we are getting that some are saying they are prepared to go back, but some are saying, you know, they are scared. Houses have been burned, families have been displaced, and there is no guarantee that, I mean, your life won't be in danger when you go back there. So these are some of the challenges which I think that when we talk about this election, I don't think it's just a 2-week thing. I mean, monitors should be there, have adequate time to really go into these areas. Yes, I do agree that the presence of international monitors somehow makes a difference. But as long as Zimbabweans are left on their own, with the military out there in the rural areas, up to 2 weeks before election, obviously everybody's going to run away. Who is going to provide transport for these people to go back and vote in their areas? So these are some of the challenges which, when we are covering our stories, we hear these stories. We let people talk about their experiences. We receive emails on a daily basis, people talking about what's happening in their communities and how they would want things to be done. But unfortunately, you know, they don't have the support. Right now, the Movement for Democratic Change head office is full of people who have just, I mean, left their homes. They cannot stay in the rural areas, and they don't have the capacity, again, to take care of them. Some of them were taken by other organizations, were sent back to the MDC head office because they've nowhere to place these people. So these are some of the challenges that when we are reporting about what's happening in Zimbabwe, and here is a crisis, I mean, which seems to be affecting almost everybody in the rural areas, but no one coming up with a solution for the poor rural people who, for the first time, participated in this political process and ensured that, I mean, they were choosing a leader of their choice. And I don't think ZANU-PF ever thought that was going to happen, that overnight people in the rural areas were going to change like that. I think it was through also, you know, people, I mean, having the media access, like the radio, Shortwave Radio Africa, Studio 7, I mean, reaching people in the rural areas, hearing people talking about what they are going through. Somehow it changed their thinking and contributed to this new thinking which is there in the rural areas. But the challenge is now is, are these people going to go back into the rural areas and vote? And if they're going to go, who is going to provide the means for their transport, accommodation boards? Some of them have no homes. The homes were burnt. So these are some of the challenges which have already been said by my colleagues here, that, I mean, when we are looking at this election in Zimbabwe, on the actual polling day, it will be quiet. But what's happening now will have a bearing on the runoff on June 27. I think I would rather stop here and wait for questions.
Thank you very much, Ray. Well, we've had a pretty gruesome description of the conditions on the ground and the enormous challenges that face Zimbabweans with the pending runoff election. Let's turn now to Gail Smith to comment on the regional implications and on the policy dimension.
Thank you, Howard, and I would encourage people to come to any events you have here in August when it's 120 degrees out, because your air conditioning works really, really well. And I apologize for my antics up here, but there's a vent here, and I'm sitting going, yeah, okay, okay, policy. Listening to the three speakers here, I think one of the things that saddens and stuns me the most is that given the depth of this crisis, in terms of the future of Southern Africa, of Zimbabwe, and most importantly of its people, the media coverage in this country is nil. Once every couple weeks, there's a story that says Zimbabwe's in crisis. There will be a story a couple of days before the runoff, and one or two stories afterwards. And I think one of our biggest challenges is to shed some light on this. And so I want to salute everyone on the panel, and particularly those who are working as journalists to get the news out. I think there's several things this means for us, and I'm reminded that in the last several years, people talked about Cote d'Ivoire in West Africa, Kenya in East Africa, and Zimbabwe in Southern Africa as anchor states. These were countries where the economies were functioning relatively well, where the institutions of the state were relatively strong, and where civil society organizations were robust. And I think it's not without significance that we've seen in all three very, very volatile, destabilizing events that all have to do with the transition to democracy. And I think the first lesson for policy is that we grossly oversimplify what these transitions are about. In Zimbabwe, I mean, one of the transitions we're also seeing is the transition from a liberation movement to a political party. And this is happening across the continent, where you have liberation movements that have succeeded usually against violent oppressors, and therefore are heroic and national leaders, but have a very difficult time making the transition to transparent and open democracy. We're seeing observation. I would strongly agree with the point. I think it's great that there will be observers there for the runoff, but they're far too few, and they're there for far too short a time, looking at far too few things. That's another thing we've got to think about. The third is, what is our plan B? What if June 27th goes like the last election did? What if the MDC wins and the government comes out with even greater reprisals than we've seen so far? To the best of my knowledge, at the level of policy, whether at the United States level, the UN Security Council, anywhere else, there is no plan B, particularly and most importantly for protecting the citizens of Zimbabwe. A second area where I think we've got a huge policy gap that this exposes is on weak and failing states, which is something that President Bush talked about in his 2002 National Security Strategy, where he said they pose even a greater threat than strong states. But 5 years later, we do not have a strategy, 6 years later, excuse me, for dealing with weak and failing states. Zimbabwe has been declining for 10 or 15 years. When I was at the NSC, when Howard was at the State Department, we were trying to figure out what to do about Robert Mugabe and the fact that he was going to take the country right down the deep end. And what's happened by not having any strategy for this is that the world has allowed Zimbabwe's strengths, its economy, its state institutions, and its civil society organizations to be weakened. I think there's another question here about what are the role of our own agencies in this. One of our best agencies, and we have someone here today from there, is our Office of Transition Initiatives. It's the office in USAID that is best equipped to deal with any of this, but it's an office that has a tiny budget and, quite frankly, relatively little power within the government, when arguably it's one of our best tools. A third area where I think we have huge policy questions is, what does this tell us about the dynamics of Africa and politics in Africa, about where African governments are coming out on human rights, on democracy, and on economics? And I think there's an important lesson here, which is that we're not dealing with a situation where one size fits all. African unity, I think, is important to African governments. The AU is terribly important. SADC and other regional organizations are important. But within those, there are divergent views. Our diplomacy has tended to ignore that altogether. It's certainly my understanding that within Southern Africa, I don't think there's majority opinion in favor of the way President Mbeki has handled this. But our diplomacy, the UN's diplomacy, the Europeans' diplomacy assumes that Africa has monolithic views, and then therefore we approach things that way. Similarly, I think this shows that our partnerships, even though they've grown and been strengthened, are not really strategic. The United States has a great relationship with SADC. Economic ties are deepening. There's political engagement. But I think if we had a serious strategic relationship, we would be talking to SADC about the effect of the crisis in Zimbabwe on the entire sub-region. And I think we would have been discussing that with SADC for some time. Tragically, I think this crisis also exposes the fragility that is South Africa. The attacks on migrants, many of them Zimbabwean, in South Africa are horrific, shocking, but unfortunately I think increasingly to be expected. And I think what we're seeing exposed here is the weakness of the South African economy and the weakness of South Africa's political culture, both at home and in the region, for this to have happened. Now, what does this mean going forward? I think there are three things that the U.S. and the rest of us need to focus on in terms of thinking about what a policy might be. And as near as I can tell, our policy at this point is to robustly condemn Mugabe, who I think has proven that he's not very frightened of statements, has been to contemplate maybe increasing sanctions but not having done anything about it yet, and to basically cast off responsibility to a sub-region which is at best divided. The first thing is we've got to look at Zimbabwe as something other than a boutique issue. There is a tendency in U.S. foreign policy to see Africa as the last on the list of priorities. And so crises like Zimbabwe are there when senior policymakers have time. I think we can already see the ripple effects in Southern Africa, the devastating effects within Zimbabwe. On top of this crisis, they're facing the escalation in world food prices and in oil prices. Zimbabwe risks going under economically, as our other panelists have said. That should be of concern to us. As well, our common humanities should be of some concern to us. I mean, we all know what robust, engaging elections are like. We're having one here, but we're not seeing people disappearing, dying, being slaughtered, being intimidated, being murdered, having to hide in their houses or in MDC offices from the government. Second, we're going to have to be ready to pick up the pieces. And I think the transition in Zimbabwe, whatever form it takes, and I would strongly advocate that the United States needs contingency plans. We need one plan for a good case scenario. In other words, the runoff turns out, as I think most of us would expect, the MDC wins, and by some shocking change in dynamics, Robert Mugabe says, oh, well, you won, I lost, good luck, and I will step back. That's going to need to be a very robust package of support from the international community, economically and politically. But we also need to prepare for scenarios where it goes south. And I think the evidence of the last couple of years suggests that that's the more probable scenario. Is there going to be a need for a regional or international force to protect civilians? Is there going to be increased violence? Are there going to be human rights monitors deployed? Are the election observers going to stay any longer than is currently planned? And what are we going to do in either scenario about peace in Zimbabwe? Because I think this is more than a crisis of elections. This is in many ways a war. And resolving it in the medium to long term is going to take a great deal of political work, a great deal of reconciliation, and something far more complex than just saying to the MDC if they win, well, you won, obviously you're the Democrats, ZANU-PF is gone, and it's all settled. It is never that simple. Finally, and I would like to go to my colleague's point, particularly on rural voters. I think one of the lessons we have to take from this, the point was made, and it's a very poignant one, that for a lot of people in rural areas, they have voted believing that their vote would make a difference, believing that if they went in to the booth and cast their ballot and their candidate won, that democracy would work. Right now, the lesson they're getting is that democracy doesn't work, that it's a sham. And by our silence, I would argue, on the stage of the international community, we are reinforcing that message. And perhaps of all the tragedies befalling Zimbabwe today, this may be the greatest, because those people, I think, are counting not only on their government, but also on the rest of the world to affirm that small hope that their vote might count for something. And with that, Howard, I will end and go
Great.
back to hiding from the air conditioner.
Thank you, Gail, for laying out a number of options and things we ought to be considering as we go forward. Let's turn it immediately to the audience and invite your questions. There'll be a microphone circulating. I'd ask that we'll group questions 3 at a time, and we'd ask you to identify yourself and your affiliation, please. And right there. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. My name is Anna Ariam from the Netherlands Embassy. I had a question for Ms. Smith. What should President Mbeki do, according to you, to solve this crisis? And how should the U.S. Exert pressure on South Africa in order to solve the crisis?
Thank you. There was a question right here in the middle, too. Did you have one? Yeah.
Actually, I could probably do it without the microphone.
Well, no, we need the mic for the webcast. Thank
Sorry. My name is Josh Kennedy. I'm from the Genocide Intervention Network, and my question is about the increasing anti-immigrant violence in South Africa. Up to this point, South Africa appears to be operating as a safety valve for Zimbabwean migrants. So if violence occurs, they are able to leave the country. What will the effect on the closing off of the safety valve have on the levels of violence taking place in Zimbabwe?
Okay, thank you. And then one in the back.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth. I'm from IFES. My question is to all the panelists. Can we, at this point, if Mugabe rigs the election again, can we approach the UN to invoke the responsibility to protect that was invoked in Darfur?
Okay, thank you. Okay, who would like to begin responding to one or more of those questions? Great, go ahead.
Well, I'll start with President Mbeki. My hope would be that President Mbeki would invoke the best of the anti-apartheid struggle as the basis for condemning somebody who was a comrade in that struggle but has since, and I'm talking about Robert Mugabe, violated everything that struggle stood for. I wish I could say that that's what he's going to do. I think it's very doubtful, given what we've seen thus far. In terms of the U.S. pressuring South Africa, I have to say, quite frankly, that I'm not persuaded that this administration has a great deal of credibility to provide that pressure. I wish it were otherwise true, but I don't honestly think pressure from the United States is going to make a great deal of difference. Instead, I would look much more towards a coordinated response from donors, including and importantly in partnership with some African governments, but also more than just the U.S. and Europe. There are other countries that are involved with and have relations with Africa, and to provide a sort of pressures and incentives package, and to make clear to Mbeki that his status as the leader of a country which has for several years been a beacon of hope for the entire continent and the entire world, is that the world's going to call it what it is. That unfortunately, unless South Africa and other countries take stronger measures, they're ultimately complicit in the deterioration of Zimbabwe, but also provide incentives. and make very, very clear to President Mbeki and the rest of the region that the international community will be there with a robust transition package that includes dealing with refugee flows, with other spillover impacts, with reigniting the Zimbabwean economy in a regional context, that will be available if the region pushes this in the right direction. Quickly on that, the anti-immigrant violence, I think I'll let our colleagues who have been in Zimbabwe more recently than I talk about what impact that might have on the internal situation. On the R2P question of invoking the responsibility to protect, this has come up a lot recently in terms of Burma, Myanmar, and I think what would need to happen here, and I think it's something worth exploring, is that the UN Security Council would have to take a decision that what is unfolding in Zimbabwe constitutes crimes against humanity. If that is the case, then the responsibility to protect is invoked. Now, at the level of principle, I think that's a very good idea. At the level of practice, it has been invoked in the case of Darfur, and it has not made one bit of difference in terms of the response of the international community. So I think there is some danger to invoking it, creating hopes on the parts of many, and then not delivering. The other related thing that could be done here is for the Security Council to make a referral to the International Criminal Court on the grounds that war crimes or crimes against humanity have been committed, and ask the ICC to look at the evidence and see whether there's sufficient evidence for indictments.
I'd like to build what Gail spoke about with regard to President Mbeki and the possibility of South Africa engaging, and I agree with everything that Gail said. But in the interest of coming up with contingency plans, the question has to be asked: what if President Mbeki is not the avenue by which there's a negotiated settlement in Zimbabwe? Differing minds can look at the situation and say that, on the one hand, President Mbeki's been an honest broker with an impossible situation that just may not be able to mediate given the current circumstances. The other view is that President Mbeki has not been a complete honest broker and had a vested interest in, if not perpetuating President Mugabe in power, and at least a transition to some more moderate ZANU-PF government. And it's not my position to say which of those is correct, but I think what we can say is that the actions that have taken up to now have not led to any significant change on the ground in Zimbabwe. What they've also done is sidestepped some other SADC nations that are more affected by the Zimbabwean crisis. Certainly South Africa has been greatly affected, specifically with the recent anti-immigrant violence. But South Africa has a much greater capacity to withstand the economic hit and the political hit. It is the unquestioned economic and political leader of the region. Countries like Zambia and Botswana that rely to a greater extent on tourism and regional trade, those countries have been hit very heavily, and those leaders are becoming increasingly unhappy with the situation in Zimbabwe. Many of them have spoken up privately in the past from the readouts that we've had from private SADC meetings, but have been encouraged to toe the SADC line to just kind of continue on and see what happens. So in terms of steps for the future, we need to look beyond South Africa. We need to look at President Kikwete in Tanzania, the current chairman of the African Union, specifically Zambia, specifically Botswana, to find out what role regionally they can play in terms of mediation. If SADC is going to have an effect on the current situation in terms of stepping in and trying to mediate a solution, whether that is government of national unity or convincing President Mugabe to take an exit package, it has to be a SADC-wide effort. The chances that South Africa can step in and do it unilaterally, I think, are increasingly slim. So for the international community, I think that means just recognizing other SADC voices more, engaging them more in a wider solution to the crisis, and helping them by just providing some support as a backstop as they go forward.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Ray.
Sorry. I just wanted to respond to the lady who asked that if Mugabe rigs the election, should the matter be taken to the United Nations, right? There are some problems here, if you look at it, because there are other countries that are very much interested in bringing the Zimbabwean issue on the UN Security Council, but there are other countries who would definitely veto that, would oppose that. So the starting point here is that is SADC itself prepared really to take this issue further? And if SADC is prepared, then the next step it is to go to the African Union. Is the African Union prepared to deal with the Zimbabwe crisis and solve it, and accept that they have failed? Therefore, it should be taken up further to the United Nations. I don't see that happening. It's a dream, because I mean there are some blocks that are already in place there that are making sure that the Zimbabwean issue does not get to the United Nations. Even to get out of SADC itself, there have been a problem between SADC and the African Union to an extent that when the opposition are saying, no, we have dealt with SADC, but SADC seems to be failing. We have dealt with Mbeki. The opposition approached the chairman of the SADC, Levi Mwanawasa, that they are no longer happy with Mbeki to continue with his mediation. Right now, Mbeki, I don't know who he's mediating for. The opposition have totally rejected him. So if he's talking to the ZANU-PF government, so it's a two-way process between ZANU-PF and Mbeki. But the MDC, they've disowned him. So it's an unfortunate situation where you find that the international pressure too, when they want to do their pressure, they're a little bit more cautious. They don't want to be seen as if they are bullying themselves into SADC or Southern Africa. But surprisingly, we also see them bullying themselves too in other areas. But when it comes to Africa, I don't know why they don't want really to put some pressure. Yes, I understand, like African Union itself, the forces, we know who is sponsoring them. So there are ways of dealing with African leaders and find ways to make them, play an active role on Zimbabwe. Mbeki has tried, maybe he has got his formula which he wanted to implement. Nobody knows. He's keeping it in his head, but up to now, it hasn't yielded anything. And we are getting into this runoff. And I foresee from what we hear and what we talk about that we may be entering a crisis which is going to be more serious than the one that we are currently facing. So I think the world should start, opening up its eyes and see Zimbabwe as a country that is in crisis and that there is a need for urgent action on Zimbabwe.
Let me speak briefly to the question regarding the safety valve. I lived in Johannesburg for 2 years prior to being back here in DC and then working on Zimbabwe. I think there's 2 points to consider that are important. I think, as Jamal and Gail mentioned, Botswana and Zambia are interested, Mwanasa and Ian Kama, primarily because the refugee outflows from Zimbabwe come to South Africa, Botswana, and Zambia. And then Kikwete in Tanzania, I think, because of the regional role he's playing in the AU, and then prior to that with SADC. But the points to consider here, I think, are twofold. One, that the Zimbabwean diaspora that's fleeing Zimbabwe overland to South Africa, Botswana, and Zambia is primarily, in comparison to other diaspora flows in the region, is primarily well-educated and skilled labor. And I think it's important to note that in comparison to, say, the Rwandan genocide in '94, the DRC outflows, the Ugandan and Kenyan crises, it's important to note that the issue regarding the anti-foreigner violence in Johannesburg, and speaking to colleagues on the ground there, is both a mix of violence against foreigners who have, quote-unquote, taken jobs, so it's a scapegoating phenomenon, as well as it is an issue that Gail mentioned before about the South African economy itself, as well as a third factor of sort of organized crime and the influence that has, a huge influence and impact that has in South Africa in particular. So I think it's important to sort of parse out these different aspects. I think that the levels of violence in South Africa will have an impact in sort of closing that valve off somewhat. But I think that Botswana and Zambia do provide some repository for Zimbabwean migrants fleeing the violence and intimidation in that country, and will continue to do so. I think another point to note is that, throughout Zimbabwe's crisis of the last 10, 15 years, people have spoken to the declining economy, the inane inflation figures, the lack of food on the ground, crop shortfalls and shortages, and the country still trudges along somehow and in some respect. And I think while the economy is, I think, it's not a necessary condition for some sort of change in the country. And I think the same can be said to hold true for migrants. They are a part of what will be a problem in the country, but will not be one of the factors that will turn the situation around?
I'd like to just pose one question to the panel. I want to harken back to the comment that was made earlier about the ambivalence in the way the government has approached this issue of elections. On the one hand, using intimidation, using violence, but on the other hand, also wanting to maintain a degree of legitimacy. That's been consistent, incidentally, with Mugabe, who in my dealings with him was always very upset with the proposition that somehow he might not be committed to the rule of law. And I wonder if it would not be more useful as the diplomatic community approaches this coming election in Zimbabwe to set down very clearly a marker. That is that any government elected under conditions of violence, intimidation, or illegality should not expect to be automatically recognized by members of the diplomatic community. And that whether or not there will be recognition of the government will be very much a function of the provision of international monitors to attest to the validity of the ballots, of the lack of violence on the ground, etc. I don't know whether it's possible or not for the American government or for other governments around the world to take that kind of posture in advance, but I think a collective international statement by a large segment of the diplomatic community might have some real impact on the way the government approaches the lead up to the election. Reactions?
I think there could be some merit in that. I'd tweak it a little bit. One of the things that Mugabe has done very effectively, and it's quite cynical, but I think he's used it to his advantage, is that every time that there's pressure, he makes this great appeal to not only Zimbabwean but African nationalism and independence. This is the West trying to tell us what to do. This is a conspiracy by the British to recolonize. Now, I would be very surprised if the majority of Zimbabweans were willing to buy that anymore. I'm sure they don't. But I think within Africa, he uses that to his advantage. Because there is some, and I think in many cases, understandable tension in Africa and frustration about the tendency of, in particular, the United States, but also our European allies, to be the arbiter of what is democratic and what is not. And as we all know, we tend to be fairly selective in our identification of what's democratic and what's not. I mean, Saudi Arabia is one of our key allies. That's not missed by anybody in Africa. Yet, we lay down very stringent requirements in Africa. So I think the first thing would be that something like that would have to come from more than just the U.S. government. Importantly, I think it would be interesting to think about whether there could be a parallel or in combined effort by some of the institutions on the ground that are, for example, providing as observers to lay down some markers. I think at a general level, the notion of laying down a series of markers, of anticipating what is likely to happen in the number of ways it could go, could be a very wise thing because it allows the international community to avoid what it's done thus far, is waiting till it blows up and then reacting. There should be markers laid down in terms of how votes are counted, in terms of when results are announced, so on and so forth. So I think that kind of laying down of markers would be good, but I think it's got to come from, quite frankly, a larger voice that is going to be perceived as more credible.
Howard, I think your point about legitimacy is, I think, very, very important and key in Zimbabwe. I think Zimbabwe, in comparison to countries throughout the world, let's say, take, for example, Angola, there's, I guess, a sense, for folks of surprise and bewilderment about why, if you're going to rig election, why not rig it outright, right? Why go through the process of actually holding the election, releasing the results, having a quote-unquote independent election commission? Why go through the sort of, the whole game? And I think what's important to hear and what I think some folks on the ground speak to about Zimbabwe and its political structure is wanting to maintain this veneer of legitimacy. It's not actually legitimacy they crave, it's the veneer of it. It's the facade of, the laws and regulations, the rule of law, jurisprudence, etc., and due process. Now, knowing that information, what does that then imply or signify for what action can take place on an international or regional or local level? And I think, going to Gail's point, I think the international piece should be in concert with regional and local action. And regionally, it should focus on SADC as sort of the main point of leverage. And now SADC has principles that govern democratic elections that were approved a number of years ago. Now, if there is, I think, more concerted effort and leverage placed on international folks, whether it be at the UN or at other institutions and at the AU, to focus and move folks within SADC to use those principles and then judge or assess Zimbabwe's elections or election environment, in particular the pre-electoral environment, on those standards, I think we can move somewhere towards finding some semblance of actual practice on the ground that makes for a level electoral playing field, without which I think when we come to June 27th, we'll see the same sort of game being played that we saw at the end of March.
And I think it's especially perilous for Western policymakers too, because with any set of standards, the SADC election standards or any international accepted definition of a free and fair election, if you apply those to Zimbabwe, from the minute that you agree to apply them, you already have to come to the conclusion that they're not free and fair. There's no way you can have a free and fair election when you've got 50, 60 deaths and tens of thousands of displaced. Already by definition, it's gone. But as Gail said, Mugabe's made a living over the past 10 years of playing SADC off against the West. And if you come into a situation where, again, you have very, very strong Western pronouncements immediately after the election that the election is not free and fair, that the government is not elected, that puts pressure on SADC from two sides. On the one hand, their observers cannot be seeing free and fair conditions, but on the other, if they recognize that immediately, they're kind of thrown in and being seen as forced to choose sides between other African nations in the West, at least by Mugabe. And I think that the key in this is going to be very strong, very intelligent diplomacy. Now, I'm not suggesting at all that Western nations shouldn't condemn the election if it turns out like we think it's going to turn out. Quite the contrary. But I think that there needs to be a lot more back-channel relationships being built between Western countries and SADC countries. Those partnerships have been frayed over the last few years because of the propaganda that's been coming out of Harare. And if you could have a situation where SADC took the lead on that, or at least worked and appeared to be in some kind of partnership in observing the elections with Western nations, I think that would be much stronger than Western nations making pronouncements and then having it appear that SADC is either rubber stamping the West or rubber stamping Harare. So it's a very delicate diplomatic balance, but one that needs to be watched.
Thank you. Open up for another round of questions here. Right down here. Hadi.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sue Onslow, Cold War Studies Centre, London School of Economics. Jamal, you mentioned opening up back channels. Given that this election seems to be a complete travesty, a betrayal of the people of Zimbabwe, what do you think for the possibility of the United States government opening up back channels with members of ZANU-PF? Robert Mugabe, after all, is an older man. He is known to be suffering from cancer. He is mortal. So why not? I mean, yes, observe elections, but the pragmatic approach of exploring the possibilities of the future government of Zimbabwe using that generous aid package you mentioned. Also, what of financial sanctions? The Zimbabwe economy is maintained by that informal economy, remittances. Is it possible in some way to manage how the organized crime syndicate running the country, which exports its own wealth, can indeed be pressured into collaborating for Zimbabwe's future?
Thank you. And in the middle, question
there. Briggs Bomber, I'm with Africa Action. 3 questions. The first one, is there a way of rebuilding confidence in the electoral process before June 27? Because I think from all the panelists who spoke, it's clear that the level of confidence that we had in the last election has completely, especially in opposition circles, has dissipated. So is there a way for the opposition to sort of rebuild? Because I think the excitement and the participation that we saw was a result of some level of confidence. So is there a way that the opposition can rebuild, confidence amongst its forces? And then secondly, we know that the militia that has been going around targeting people, especially in rural areas, has been using the results that were posted on polling stations to know that in this ward, 70 people voted for the opposition, 80 people voted for the opposition. So how do you see that requirement playing in? I know the very positive role that it played in allowing the independent groups to, independently tally the outcome. But it seems to be backfiring again. So how can that be handled? Especially, as Ray said, people were attacked and, they don't seem to have really been supported or defended. So, again, are people going to go out knowing very well that they're going to be posted to say, 100 of you voted, and then, they go around identifying that. Then the other thing, my reading is that ZANU-PF has moved away from a civil struggle mode to a war mode, where people are now being abducted. Back in the day, you'd be abducted, but you'd be released, or you'd be detained and released. But now you have people abducted and they are killed. And this is the first time that we've had actually a casualty of this magnitude. Even in the previous violent elections, it was just a few people, but now we're talking of 50. So is there an alternative form of engagement that is permissible in this day and age for the opposition, especially when it's clear that, the other part is no longer engaging on a civil basis. It's now, a war. So how do you engage? Then the last question, I know the panel did not touch on it, but people have been talking about a negotiated settlement on the basis that June 27 simply does not allow for a free and fair election. So a negotiated settlement, in a sense, that brings in a transitional government with a special mandate to, democratize institutions, open up space. Is that a feasible option? Is it something that, different advocacy groups should be pushing? How do you see that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. For our last question in the back.
Chachen, freelance correspondent. The country is very much divided. Is there a person to be emerged who could unite the country? And second is the economy is bad, but the country is rich in natural resources. What's the situation of extractive industry, and what's its export situation? Thank you.
And could I add a PS to the first of those two questions regarding assessment of Emerson Mnangagwa's current status within the ZANU divided party? How ascendant is he? Is he really very strong, or are there some significant challenges within ZANU-PF? Just by way of background, Emerson is the individual who led the massacre of Ndebele back in the early days of the Mugabe regime, and more recently was the president of the National Assembly at one point in Zimbabwe.
I may take the first question just because it was multifaceted and I don't trust my memory. So, but it was about back channels between the U.S. and ZANU-PF, and also about the financial sanctions and remittances. Step one, I think that there needs to be determination as to which way international pressures are going to go. Is it going, there's an opportunity for a negotiated settlement. It's something that should be explored, but we also have to face the very real possibility that ZANU-PF will just thumb their noses at the world and try to remain in power, in which case there needs to be a secondary plan of increased pressure, which is something we touched on in the Enough report. Absolutely, financial sanctions should be strengthened, and that's something that there's been a lot of misconception about that. The targeted financial sanctions on Zimbabwe right now are on a specific number of ZANU-PF officials. They're not sanctions on Zimbabwe as a whole. They have very little, if no effect, on the national economy, but they impact the personal finances of ZANU-PF officials very severely. Now, from the in my visits from the ZANU-PF officials I've talked to, the sanctions are one of the elements that greatly play into the splits within the party. High officials are seeing their bank accounts dry up. They're seeing their sources of foreign currency dry up. They're not able to conduct international business deals that will keep them afloat nearly as much as they could in the past. Those absolutely need to be strengthened. The propaganda that's been coming out of Harare that the sanctions are the cause of the economy is absolutely ludicrous. And we could talk here for hours about the causes of the decline in the Zimbabwean economy, but they're wholly rooted within ZANU-PF. In terms of the remittances, that's a much more delicate situation. Remittances from Zimbabweans abroad, specifically in the UK and South Africa, are really the lifeline of the country, but also the lifeline of common people. If you crack down on remittances, there's a very real, there's a good chance that it will cut down on currency flows going into the leadership, but it's definitely going to cut down on currency flows going into the average person. Then you impact people's ability to buy food for whatever ability they have, or to buy other basic necessities. So that's something that I think many people have been loath to touch, because you would turn a situation where you already have mass starvation and would make it much, much worse. In terms of back channels between the U.S. and ZANU-PF, I can't say with any certainty that they're occurring, but I would be highly surprised if they're not. The question is, what role does the U.S. play in terms of international pressure? It's been very much the bulldog, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think that ZANU-PF is relying on some European counterparts that are more have played more role in looking for a negotiated settlement to ease things. The ZANU-PF is probably looking to the U.S. to get some type of assurance on personal security. But again, as we spoke before, there needs to be a corresponding package of incentives for transition and a package of pressures. The incentives, if there is a transition in Zimbabwe, Mugabe retires, whether that means just his non-involvement in political affairs or his exile. The international community, if there's a transition to a democratic government, needs to come in with financial incentives to help rebuild Zimbabwe's relationship with multilateral institutions, to help get fuel in, help rebuild some of the infrastructure to get it back on its feet. But there are a lot of ifs for that package to come into play. You would need a legitimate democratic government. In terms of the package of pressures, I think we need to think very seriously about stronger action against Mugabe and the leadership for the crimes against humanity that they've been committed. Zimbabwe is a prime candidate to be referred to the ICC for prosecution. Now, you can get into a very, very long argument about is Zimbabwe as bad as some other massacres in some other politically unstable places. That's an open question, but there is no question that the regime in power now is guilty of crimes against humanity. That's pressure number one. Regional pressure. If Mugabe stays in power and through wholly undemocratic means, we have to consider this a coup. If there is a coup in Zimbabwe, according to African Union rules, Zimbabwe should be suspended from the African Union. This is step two. We need to look at other multilateral institutions. We could also spend hours talking about all the violations of the SADC Charter that Zimbabwe has violated. SADC is probably not in a position right now to consider suspension, but there at least should be some type of pressure going forward in terms of what its role within SADC is and what effect it has on the legitimacy of SADC. And SADC is, I think, a much more is a weakened institution because of the crisis. It's an opportunity for SADC to show its strength, but it's really teetering on the crisis right now. So there are several opportunities in terms of pressures and incentives, but I think that we need to take the cues from the ground, but we can't wait. We need to start developing contingency plans now.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I'll take the three questions you spoke about regarding the electoral process. Your first one about rebuilding confidence and sort of at what point does the opposition or anyone else say that this election can be free and fair or not? I focus on two things we mentioned before. One is the pre-electoral environment. I think it goes without saying that right now we're not going to. What's happening right now, what will happen sort of through until June 26th, the day before the election, will not meet the conditions for a free and fair electoral playing field, whether in regards to the media holding rallies or the harassment and levels of violence in the country. What I think we can hope for is that on election day, which has happened previously in Zimbabwe, on election day, there is no violence, and that local, regional, and hopefully, but not likely, international observation takes place. Now, what's important to note here, and I'll come to your point about the posting of the results outside the polling booths, is that there should also be observation of the counting and tabulation process. Now, that's the place where a lot of folks have suspected that the regime and or the commission has rigged the election, is that voting takes place all fine and well on the ground at the polling booth, but when the results are then taken to the district and provincial and then national level, that the vote count and results are then tampered with. So it's important that the observation process, the monitoring process, is not just at the polling booths level, but also at the level of the district, province, and then nationally at the tabulation center. That should be open to both the opposition political groups as well as civic groups locally and nationally and regionally to observe. In regards to what impact the posting of the results outside the polling booth will have, as you mentioned, it may have a deleterious impact in that it will then show where the opposition has more support and then can then target those citizens. What I would say is that ZANU-PF and the regime have always known where the opposition generally has had support in the country. What I think they have been surprised by right now is, or in the last election round, was in those areas where they previously held control, but have now lost. So those swing constituencies. And I think that's the areas where you will need increased level of monitoring and observation. So if SADC is only going to field 200 observers or thereabouts, the AU hopefully comes in, the Pan-African Parliament, they will need to focus on those areas where the opposition won, where the regime had previously held those positions or constituencies and those seats in the last two elections. I'm sure you people know about how a lot of the senior ZANU-PF leadership lost their seats in this last election round. I think those places in particular are places to focus on. In terms of whether there's an alternative for the opposition in regards to competing in this process, I don't think there is. I think given the stance of the MDC, and I think it's a correct one, that they should be involved and should compete in this process, even though the electoral playing field is nowhere near level, is important for them politically. And I think for them to engage in any other mechanism or manner will remove the one thing I think they have right now, which is they still have a high level of legitimacy and credibility locally among citizens in Zimbabwe, regionally as well as internationally, among a number of different important players that have influence and impact both right now and will have impact and influence going forward in the process in a transition. And I think if the MDC were to engage in any other manner, I think they would lose that one crucial factor that they need.
Thank you very much. Ray has a media deadline, so we'll give him this opportunity to make his last comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Briggs. Building confidence, I think time has come for Zimbabwe to go back, I think, to 1980. When Mugabe went for this election, he was not comfortable, and therefore there were monitoring forces who were deployed to the then Rhodesia to ensure that there was no violence, and after the election that there were no violence. I think this is the only thing that can build confidence. Because if people are going to see the monitors and after they're gone, people will start being beaten up. So I think there must be some kind of guarantee that after this electoral process, their lives are not in danger. So the presence of international forces, because the forces in Zimbabwe are no longer neutral. It has been proved. So we need some international forces to be involved. Posting of results really played a very important role. But then it had also its negative effect that people were being easily identified. But I still think that it is important that these results are posted at the polling stations. Because even if they are not posted, still the machinery does know. Because they still have access to those papers, even if they are not posted outside. So they will still know who voted. War mode, I agree with you. What we are getting and reporting about, it really shows that, even the people who were on the ground, they are being told that Zimbabwe is at war. And that Zimbabwe is under military rule. You have military officers who have been deployed all over the country. That has been documented. Something needs to be done. So that's why I'm saying that, the best scenario here would be to have a neutral force. Because the Zimbabwean forces themselves are not neutral, they are partisan. Negotiated settlement, an interesting subject. But who's going to sit down and negotiate? Mugabe and Tsvangirai to sit down and agree? I don't know. Mugabe doesn't want to hear much about Tsvangirai. I guess Tsvangirai might give in room for Mugabe, but Mugabe has made it quite clear, unless somebody has forced him. You raise the issue of Emerson Mnangagwa. Emerson Mnangagwa is not popular, and Mugabe is not popular. And these are individuals who want to remain in power, using whatever they have. Mnangagwa lost in an election when he wanted to be elected as chairman of the party. He lost to 8 provinces. If he was as popular as people would want to think, therefore he should have been elected by the people within ZANU-PF. But he's somebody who has control of the top brass in the military. He has been very close to Mugabe, but he does not have the popular support. There is the other faction, which is the Mujuru one, are more popular than the Mnangagwa. My time is not on my side. I could have talked a little bit more, but I've got a deadline. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ray. And for our last comment, I know you may have to leave before we finish it, which is fine. Gail, please.
I don't know that there's much to add. The only thing I would say in conclusion is, and I think it resonates in all the comments that have just been made, that whatever the strategy, it's got to be sustained and go well past June 27th. I mean, even if it is increasing targeted financial sanctions, that's one step. There have to be multiple steps afterwards. And I think one of the worst things we can do for Zimbabwe is just to continue to react. So if I were still in government, which is highly unlikely, I would certainly be arguing for at least a 6-month strategy for how we're going to respond to it.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for an illuminating discussion of the situation on the ground and some thoughts on the way forward. And thanks to all of you for joining in the program this morning.